Welcome back to Mercenarys Star by William H. Keith Jr. We shall continue the saga of the beginnings of the Grey Death Legion. Chapter 9. Sue Ellen Klein followed Jeff's crippled Chippewa into the atmosphere. Re-entry friction had heated the wildly bucking craft to a cherry glow, and fragments from the damaged ship began flaking off in a glittering stream of fiery particles. 50 kilometers behind, the larger fragments tapped against Klein's cockpit like the beginnings of a summer shower. Pit-pat, pit-pat, pitter-pat. She could no longer use her radio. Her ship-to-ship frequency was jammed by Jeff's soul-searing shrieks as his ruptured cockpit began melting around him. There was one final duty she could perform for Jeffrick, her friend, her lover. Tears wet her face and smeared the inside of her helmet visor as she brought the HUD targeting display up one last time. Cross-haired centers on the other, Chippewa, now almost consumed in a billowing fireball, brilliant against Verthandi's cloud cover. Over the radio, the shrill screams continued, more desperate, chopped and broken now by the growing static from the ionization of superheated air. "Goodbye, Jeff," she said softly, knowing that he could no longer hear her. "I love you." Then her thumb came down on the firing button, sending paired Exo-Star short-range missiles across the gap between her ship and Jeffrick's. The fireball erupted in a flaming, hurtling fragments, then Jeff's screams ended with a suddenness that made her gasp. Almost. She almost continued her own death plunge deeper into the atmosphere, but her own well-trained pilot's mind took command and brought the ship's nose up. Like a stone skipped across calm water, the Chippewa skimmed across Verthandi's upper atmosphere, hurtling into space once more. In the planet's shadow, and with her drive throttle down, Sue Ellen's ship cooled rapidly. She remained frozen in place, aware only that her thumb still pressed the bright red firing button that had released Jeffrick from his agony. Nothing could release hers, though, as she moaned into the cooling silence. "I had to, Jeff. I had to." Sirens wailed across the wide, flat valley lined with broad-bladed stalks of deep blue vegetation. A mobile headquarters, a wheeled, multiple-trailered vehicle that dwarfed the men standing in its shadow, blared warning through its external speakers. Nearby, a Marauder hulked, motionless and waiting. Across the valley, one heavy Orion and a pair of Stingers also waited, mutely, while thunder boomed from a green-clouded sky. The Leopard dropship settled to the ground among billowing clouds of dust, whipped blue sword and venting steam. Her hull armor was scored in several places by recent battle, but the ideographs above the black on-scarlet circle dragon insignia still picked up out the ship's name, Xau. Colonel Kevlavik stepped down the ladder from the mobile HQ's cab and received a subordinate's salute. "Board the command as soon as its ramps are down, Lieutenant," he said. "I will lead the lance personally." "Sir." His communicator chirped at his belt, and he touched the switch to receive. "My Lord Colonel," a voice tinned in the speaker clipped to his ear. "Communication received from the Subutai. She has completed boarding of the company of galleons and is boosting now. Her ETA at Hunter's Cape is 20 minutes. Good. We've also got confirmation of close air support from the Regisport, my lord. Very well. Inform Subutai's commander that we should ground at the rendezvous at the same time." He checked his wrist computer. "Make it 12:40 hours, local." Kevlavik was not convinced that they would need the galleon light tanks, but they would provide useful close support in covering fire if there were rebel forces in the vicinity. Mech operations in the Sylvan Basin were always hazardous. Small rebel units were everywhere and anywhere. Though they posed no real threat to mechs, a determined attack could threaten the defensive perimeter established around a dropship landing zone. Below him, the Zhao's mech holds gaped wide. The colonel brought the transceiver to his mouth. Stand by, comm central, we're moving. He clicked to battle frequency. This is Kevlavik, Lance. Form up for boarding. As the three mechs began lumbering across the valley toward the Leopard dropship, Kevlavik climbed the ladder dangling by the leg of his Marauder, hauled himself through the narrow belly hatch, and slid behind the battle machine's controls. He swung the neural helmet and its trailing tangle of cables down from its mount and secured it across his shoulders, then checked the adjustment of the feedback loop that would mesh his sense of balance to the great machine's electronic actuators and coordinators. The Marauder stirred and lifted one armored foot. The thud of its ponderous steps hammered through the mech's open cockpit hatch as it began moving toward the valley. The Governor General's instructions had been most explicit, though the mission was a simple one. Nagumo's face and manner had showed his concern that it be successful. And when the Governor General was concerned, Colonel Kevlavik was concerned. It was a good way to retain rank, honor, and life. The intruder ship had been badly damaged during the last moments of its approach to Verthandi, and probably was destroyed during its spectacular flaming re-entry. Planet-bound radar and the combat scanners aboard the Xao had tracked its trajectory across the northern hemisphere of the planet. They had lost the signal under the clouds, somewhere among the jungles, marshes, and salt dunes of Hunter's Cape, along the coast of the Azure Sea, 600 kilometers north of Regis. It was unlikely that either vessel or passengers had survived, but an immediate inspection was still vital. Rebel forces were strong along the Azure Sea coast and further east in the Vrishaven district. Even if the blockade runner's crew was dead, the rebels might be able to salvage cargo and military supplies from the shattered wreckage. They might even find battle mechs still cradled in their travel cocoons. Even more important, the wreckage might contain some clue to the intruder dropship's origins and masters. Nagumo's orders had also gone out to the two Kurita dropships in the system. They were to ground, not at Regis, but to the north. At the edge of the Blue Sword Plateau, where a company of light tanks attached to Kevlavik's command and one lance of his own mech regiment awaited their colonel's return. Though such a mission would normally be assigned to a company commander or even to a lieutenant in command of a single mech lance, this was a special case. Colonel Kevlavik was not in the habit of delegating to junior officers when the mission was as important to the high command as was this one. He would personally search Hunter's Cape for the crash site of the downed intruder dropship. The operation's only possible weak point would be if there were any problem coordinating the Xao's landing with the Subotais. A delay in either ship's arrival would leave the other ship's forces without support. As he backed his Marauder into the harness supports in the Xao's hold, the colonel dismissed these thoughts. In 20 minutes, his mech would be on the ground. He had no doubt that they could handle anything they were likely to find at the crash site, be it survivors of the whole damn rebel army. Aerospace fighters from Regisport would provide close air support. Kevlavik was sure the Subotais tanks would not even be needed. 100 kilometers above the cloud-swirled ochres and greens of Verthandi's surface, the Subotai captain had noticed the automated distress beacon of a small craft. The ship was on a free flight course close to her own vessels, and so she altered course to intercept it. The captain assumed that it was one of the Kurita fighters damaged in the short battle with the intruder dropship. It turned out that she was wrong. The damaged fighter was a Chippewa, a design not used in Kurita space. The young woman that the Subotais techs pulled from the cockpit seemed to be in shock, unseeing, unspeaking. The captain ordered a medic to care for the prisoner, that she be given food and a comfortable place to sleep. Though the war was over for this pilot, the Subotai captain had heard enough rumors about Kurita interrogation units that she wondered if the young pilot might not have been better off in her metal coffin in space. That was not for her to decide, though, and she knew it. It was her duty to report to her superiors with the prisoner, not to tell them what to do with her. Besides, she might even get a commendation for the chance capture of one of the enemy pilots. With silent bursts from her steering jets, the Subutai eased back into a re-entry approach vector that would take her and her cargo of galleon tanks to the rendezvous at Hunter's Cape. She would be arriving late. Tolan Brazet Nuik held up one hand, and the ragged line of soldiers behind him froze in place. Their guide slipped through the twilight created by the jungle foliage, while they waited, straining every sense against the background warble of unseen life forms. Chirimsims brayed and chirped in the distance. They were a piratical-looking band, and no one knew that better than Brazetnovich himself. No two were dressed or armed the same, their uniforms a hodgepodge of civilian clothing and bits of uniforms and body armor taken from Kurita troops. Brazetnovich carried a 5mm Magna laser rifle taken from a combine soldier, and Yolev cradled the massive squad machine gun he'd lifted from the body of a Verthandian militiaman. The rest carried a variety of hunting rifles, competition weapons, and handguns. Javed carried a single-shot flare pistol with extra rounds for the ungainly, snub-nosed launcher stuffed into the pouch slung at his belt. From the brush behind them came the low rush of silenced swamp skimmer engines. That meant the pilots were keeping their vehicles ready for a fast getaway, if one was necessary. Their guide was Li Qin, son of a local plantation owner named Li Wu. None of the rebels trusted the man entirely, not with so many Orientals serving in the ranks and in command of the hated Kurita legions. Li had often helped the rebels before, however, warning them of sweeps by Kurita patrols and the ambushes along the roads of the jungle fringe. This time, Li's story of a spaceship thundering across his plantation and into the sea to the north had been too intriguing to ignore. If the man was telling the truth, the vessel had crashed just a few hours before, and it might yet be possible to salvage the wreckage before the hated brown jackets arrived on the scene. That Kurita troops would arrive was a foregone conclusion. The spacecraft was almost certainly one of theirs, probably containing military supplies that they would not want to fall into the hands of Brazetnovich's little rebel band. Radio transponders or emergency beacons would bring other dropships to rescue the first. Maybe, though, with cunning and a bit of luck, they could arrange a surprise for old Nagumo's troops when they arrived. It'd be nice to be the hunter rather than the hunted for a change. Lee signaled them ahead. They moved forward cautiously, parting the vines and overhanging branches that partly blocked the path. Beyond the jungle was the tidal marsh, a barren wasteland of salt pools, sand bars, and mud flats. Beyond that lay the sea. The sound of the surf was a gentle, distant thunder, intermittent behind the racketing of bright-winged marine ornithoids circling above the water's edge. The sea was flat and azure blue, tinged with green from the sky. Not far from shore, the surface of the water was broken by the hemispherical curve of a huge metal shell lifting and falling with the waves that broke against its steel-gray flanks. Brazetnovich raised his Micho electronic Nox to his eyes and touched the zoom adjustment. That hand scanner was a battered souvenir of a raid on Port Gaspin, and the carrying straps bore the strain of where it had bitten into the throat of its former owner. At high magnification, he could make out streaks of rust across the dropship's hull and the vast coal-black scars that spoke of violent re-entry. High up along the flank, the re-entry burns could not quite mask the black-on-red dragon circle of Kurita. Down at the waterline, waves broke and surged through a gaping hole. Everywhere, there were puckered craters and slashed and partly melted gouges of laser fire. The surf rumbled and roiled in white foam around the hulks of what appeared to be hull armor fragments or blocks of heavy machinery scattered about the wreck and sunken in the shallows along the shore. There could be no doubt that this dropship had been brought down in combat. The rebel leader dropped the scanner from his face, suddenly puzzled. What combat? If a Kurita ship had been knocked down, that meant friendly ships must be in the Norn system. But whose? The rebels had no ships of their own, no aerospace fighters, no way at all striking created dropships from the sky. Who had, and why? He raised the scanner again. Movement had attracted his eye, a disturbance along the beach. He could make out a party of men, apparently the wet and bedraggled survivors of the crash. There were too many to count. Many seemed to be what? Digging, it looked like. They were digging in the sand. And what were they doing? Burying their dead? Scratching an SOS into the sand? Strange. As he watched, black smoke began boiling from the largest knot of people. His jaw muscles clenched as he ground his teeth together, a nervous habit acquired long before coming of Kurida's soldiers. Troops and vehicles from Regis would be along at any moment to rescue their own, and they would be drawn by the smoke. The rebels would have to strike fast if they hoped to capture some of those survivors for interrogation. Brazetnovich gave orders, hand signals understood and passed on by the men waiting silently behind him. Preparation was silent, save for the soft clicks of bolt action and slide auto weapons being cocked to fire rounds. The band split up into teams of 4 and 5 men apiece, each group slipping through the jungle and out into the mud flats by a separate route. Messengers melted back into the swamp to alert the skimmer pilots. The survivors numbered perhaps 50 or 60, though small parties were scattered up and down the beach collecting boxes and crates of supplies that had drifted ashore from the wreck. None appeared to be posted as lookout, and none appeared to be armed. Brazetnovich smiled to himself. So much the better. This was going to be too easy. Grayson looked up as his communicator whispered in his ear, "They're moving, Captain. Spread out along the jungle line, range 100 meters. "I got them, Laurie," Grayson said. "Be ready." He stood up, still a bit unsteady on his feet. The shock of the fiery plummet through Verthandi's atmosphere, of Martinez's last-second thruster maneuvers, and their nearly successful landing at the edge of the Azure Sea had left him weak and rubber-kneed. It was Martinez's skill that had kept them from plunging too steeply in the atmosphere. After the grazing collision with the plummeting fighter, she had recovered control of the ship and braced them against the shuddering vibrations of re-entry, tail first. They had not burned on their descent, though the hull temperature had soared so high that outer hull elements of the main drive had slagged away entirely. Enough thrusters had survived the heat to allow their semi-guided touchdown at the water's edge. Once down, the sea had poured in through the rents and slashes in the dropship's hull, of course, but the wreck looked far worse than it actually was. 5 of the Phobos' crew had been injured in the descent, but no one was killed. That they were all alive with much of their gear was still intact, Grayson was more than willing to count as a miracle. There was even a chance that the Phobos might even fly again, if they could find enough time in a well-stocked repair facility. Repairing the Phobos would require a second miracle. Now, though, Grayson was willing to defer miracle number 2 if they could only secure a third miracle in very short order. Forces that Devik Eridin had identified as rebels were approaching rapidly, and Grayson knew that they had to establish friendly relations with them fast. If he failed, the firefight could end their mission before it had properly begun. Sergeant Ramage was on his knees nearby, using an entrenching tool from the Phobos equipment locker to scrape a hasty depression into the sand. "You look right at home, Ram," Grayson said, "and that hole looks deep enough. Why don't you pass that thing on to someone else?" "Bloody funny," Ramage said, but he grinned as he handed the tool to Tomlinson, a young tech kneeling nearby. "You never looked better, Tom," Grayson said to the tech. Tomlinson was another Trelawnese, a red-haired minor genius with things mechanical, Grayson's own personal tech. Tom had replaced his usual layer of grease with a smearing of wet sand and mud. "I'll be ready to join Ramage's commandos after this," Tomlinson said, and Grayson laughed. Ramage had been boasting of late how he would put the Verthandian rebel recruits through a Trelwyn-style commando training course. For reasons not entirely clear to Grayson, that included plenty of digging. He walked on, pacing slowly across the beach past others of his command, preparing the trenches or gathering crates washed up on the beach from the Phobos' gashed-open hold. "Steady, everyone," he said, keeping his voice low but penetrating. "They're coming. Be ready. My command." He found Eridan squatting close by the fire that several troopers had coaxed from a pile of damp driftwood with a hand laser. "Your friends are on their way. Are you sure you don't have to use any kind of password or recognition signal?" "Miserable," Eridan shook his head. "We're a good 200 kilometers from where we're supposed to be. The local commander may have heard I'd be bringing help back, but he wouldn't know when, and he wouldn't expect it here. There's a password I was to transmit on a certain radio frequency once we were grounded to let him know it was me. I doubt anyone patrolling out here would know about that." He gestured toward the wreck behind them. "That black dragon on your ship isn't going to help either." "Don't you have any way of maintaining communication through your army?" Eridan spat into the sand. "Army, Captain? The Resistance is made up of maybe 80 or 100 armies wandering all over Verthandi's northern latitudes. I think the biggest must number something like 1,000 men and women, but they're scattered among towns and plantations throughout the Breachhaven district. The smallest number is exactly one, usually some lone scavenger who likes to slit the throats of drunken militiamen in Regis alleys. A signal keened in the speaker in Grayson's ear. "Hold it," he said. "Here they come." In a glimmering curtain of spray, a skimmer foil burst from the cover of an arm of jungle reaching out onto the mudflats. At the same moment, bands of ragged men bearing awkward weapons rose from the rocks and from behind low sand dunes. There was a stutter of automatic rifle fire. "Now, everybody down!" Grayson yelled, and across the beach, men and women who had been waiting for just such an attack threw themselves flat into the shallow trenches that had been scraping into the wet sand. Grayson alone remained standing. This was the riskiest part of the plan, for now he was the only target the attacking rebels had. At the same time, though, the rebels would know something unusual was happening if this lone survivor stood, empty-handed and defenseless, on the suddenly deserted beach. He was counting on surprise and curiosity to make them hold their fire. Auto rifle slugs chittered through the air a meter above his head, and the deeper-throated wham of a hunting rifle popped a geyser of sand near his feet. Just as Grayson was thinking the guerrilla soldiers might not have the luxury of indulging their curiosity, someone began bellowing an order to cease fire. The charging rebels dropped on their tracks, wary of a trap, weapons ready. "Hold your fire," Grayson yelled. He remembered training sessions with Weapons Master Griffith and his father's regiment, and it all seemed so long ago. He shook himself. Was it only one standard year since those days? "Pitch your voice so it carries, but keep it sharp with authority, with control. If you're talking to your own troops, they have to know you're in control. If you're talking to strangers, you can't let them hear your fear. We're friends," he continued, holding his arms out from his sides, showing he was unarmed. "We want to talk." "It's a Turk, Colonel," a voice barked from behind a sand dune. There was a crack. Something hot plucked at Grayson's sleeve. "Hold your fire, damn it," another voice replied. "Dover, put that thing up." "I'm Captain Carlyle, Grey Death Mercenary Legion," Grayson continued. He had to stifle the tremor at the back of his throat, and his knees felt weaker now than they had after the crash. He wanted very much to drop to the sand, out of sight, but he knew that any sudden movement would unleash a storm of gunfire. "We were brought here to help you." There was an angry mutter from some unseen watcher, but Grayson couldn't catch the words. The second voice called back across the mudflats. "How do you know this ain't some kind of trick? One of your people is here, Devik Eridan. He brought us here. Talk to him." There was no answer. With his boot, Grayson nudged Eridan, lying flat in his shallow trench. "Come on, Citizen Eridan, stand up. Very slowly. Keep your hands where they can see them." The two stood for endless seconds. Grayson could almost hear the discussion that must be going on among the dunes behind the beach. These strangers could be telling the truth, or Eridan might be a plant, or a brain-channeled captive. It could be a trap, If it's not, the real Dracos will be along any moment, and the beach will become a trap for all of us. Grayson knew that his own success now depended on the daring of the rebel commander. The man stood up. He wore denim work clothes and a sleeveless olive drab Kurita jacket with the insignias torn off. A heavy commercial laser rifle was clenched in muddy hands, its power pack strapped to the man's thigh, its muzzle steady on Grayson's chest. On his head was a shapeless black beret. His shaggy red beard was streaked with mud. "You want to talk?" the man said. "Go ahead and talk." The rebels were not easily convinced, but it turned out that Talon Brasednowick, a self-styled colonel of the rebel militia, had indeed heard that someone had been smuggled off-world to attempt to hire mercenaries. "But damn it all," the leader said as he watched Grayson's men put out their smoky fire. "What if we'd been Dracos? You couldn't know we'd find you first." "I was given to understand that they don't come into the jungle that much." Brasednovich spat into the sand. "And you say you came here to teach us? They'll know you crashed or landed somewhere along here, and they'll be looking for you. A dropship, even a wrecked one, would be a real prize." The idea was to land in the sea near a place where the ship could be camouflaged and easily hidden. "I don't look like you're going to manage that now, unless you want to try to disguise that hulk as a rock." "No," Grayson admitted. "Still, we figured it would take them a while to get organized and to work out a search pattern." "Maybe so, but damn it all, what if we'd been a Kurita patrol?" "First lesson you'd better learn about Verthandi, feller, is that you don't take nothing out here for granted." Grayson smiled and touched the communicator at his throat. "Lori, come up on him and meet our hosts. Gently now, don't startle them." One of the shapeless masses of metal lying in the surf between wreck and shore stirred, then rose, white water cascading from the flanks, joints, and the sleek right-arm laser. 10 meters tall, the machine stood knee-deep in the surf, then strode forward, moving up onto the beach with a creak of interlocking metal parts and the dull thud of the Mech's 55-ton step. Brasednowich's jaw dropped as he looked up, and up. The Shadowhawk was Grayson's own, with Lori Kalmar at the controls. On either side, 100 meters up and down the beach, 2 more mechs rose from their watery hiding places. Delmar Clay's Wolverine and Davis Mccall's Rifleman. "You see," Grayson said as Brasednovich continued to creep up at the armored monster towering over him, "we weren't completely trusting. Think we're crazy?" Time was precious now. Brasednowich's band numbered 50 men and women and included 5 swift, flat-bottomed swamp skimmers and would be of help unloading cargo from the wreck of the Phobos. Grayson posted the Wolverine and the Rifleman inland at the edge of the jungle. While their electronic senses strained for the first hint of approaching combine forces, Lori set to work in the Shadowhawk, using the mech's powerful arms and hands to help with the unloading. They had only had time to unload the 3 heavies after they had crashed. The other 4 mechs, Lori's Locust, a Stinger, and 2 Wasps, all appeared to be intact in their shipboard cocoons, but were still sealed in storage bays. Besides these, there was a small mountain of weapons, gear, and supplies to be unloaded onto the beach. According to the rebels, a second clock was ticking away besides the one that would eventually bring Kurita forces to the crash site. Verthandi Alpha, large and close, was the cause of Verthandi's extremely high, twice-daily tides. Those tides were not as severe here above 70 degrees north latitude as they would have been close to the equator, but they were bad enough to sweep hundreds of meters up the broad, flat beaches of the Azure coast. The Phobos would be nearly submerged by the time high tide arrived in only 3 more hours. Rebels and mercenaries worked frantically. Once the Stinger and 1 Wasp were broken free of their bays, Hassan Khaled and Peter Dorowski saddled them up and brought them out onto the light. Now they worked together to free Euryliss's Wasp from its cradle, as a steady line of rebels and mercenaries used swamp skimmers and rafts to haul ashore the last of the Phobos' stored supplies. With Lori temporarily in command of the Shadowhawk, and with time short, it was decided to leave her Locust aboard the dropship for now. "Captain," Lori's voice over the earpiece snapped Grayson to no awareness. "Incoming, by air. What is it?" "Looks like a dropship on its way from Regis," Lori said. "And there's a pair of fighters flying escort." "That's confirmed, Captain." The second voice was Martinez from the bridge at the Phobos, where she was supervising the first steps of damage control for the craft. Whether or not the ship would ever fly again was an open question, but they couldn't buy Martinez and her tech some time. There was no chance at all. "We have them on the Doppler radar up here, range 80 kilometers, ETA 2 minutes. "Right. Now, abandon ship." The grounded hulk of the Phobos would be a prime target for aircraft. "But Captain, we have auxiliary power up to 3 lasers. We could provide backup." Grayson thought furiously. He weighed the value of 3 additional lasers in the coming fight with enemy air support against going back on his first order, then made his decision. "Okay, do it. Get your not-essential personnel under cover and be ready to bail out if your armor starts coming apart." He doubted that the enemy would shoot the Phobos to pieces, for the dropship was too valuable a prize. What they might do was to try to take out her lasers once they knew she was operational. "One more thing, Ilse. You fire on my command, got it? Hold your fire until I give you the nod." "You got it, Skipper." He shifted his communicator to the general combat frequency. "Scramble, everyone. We've got 2 minutes to visitors." Crates of supplies were left lying on the beach while swamp skimmers laden with troops pulled out of the swirling surf and skidded on cushions of air across sand and mud into the jungle. Battle mechs lurched from the water and strode swiftly off the beach. They left great crisscrossing trails of footprints, each as long as a man was high, but there wasn't anything that could be done about that. Grayson had hoped that the incoming tide would erase the prints, but they had run out of time. The Dracos would have learned soon enough that mechs had been aboard the downed dropship and that they had escaped. Now they had learned about it slightly earlier than Grayson had originally hoped. He turned and sprinted across the beach toward the jungle. "Lori!" he gasped as he ran. "Pick me up!" The Shadowhawk appeared against the tree line, moving with a ponderous, deliberate lope that ate up the ground between mech and running man. The Hawk's visor canopy was open, a chain-link ladder dangling across its chest. Grayson caught hold of the ladder and swarmed up the battle mech's fronts as Lori turned the Hawk gently to face the jungle and began moving back toward cover. The Shadowhawk's cockpit was cramped even when only its pilot was squeezed into the control seat beneath the tangle of conduits and cable connecting the pilot's neurohelmet to the control receptors along the cockpit overhead. When the ladder was winched in and the visor canopy sealed shut, there was but a slim strip of space behind and to the left of the pilot's seat. Grayson wedged himself into that crevice, his head tucked low to clear the coolant pipes, mounting lugs and wiring bundles for the emergency escape charges. If things got rough, if the mech was knocked down or was forced to run with him aboard, he would be in serious danger. The Shadowhawk's cramped cockpit was still preferable to the open beach. From here, you would also be better able to direct the battle. Lori sat in the chair, her hands in the console controls, her head and cascade of blonde hair completely covered by the grotesque black-visored mask of the neurohelmet. It was already stuffily warm inside the closed space, and Lori had stripped to boots, briefs, and t-shirt in preparation for the even greater heat to come. As the mech lurched its way forward, Grayson clung to overhead struts with both hands, telling himself to ignore the pleasant sight of her bare legs and to concentrate instead on the instrumentation above them. Shadow spilled across the mech's armor-embraced canopy. They were among the trees at the jungle's edge. "Just in time," Lori said, her voice muffled from inside the helmet. He tried without success to read what emotion might be in her words. He was worried about how she might face this, her first combat since Thunder Rift. But that had not been the reason why he'd joined her. There had not been time to free her Locust, and so he needed to be aboard a mech himself to coordinate the battle. "If we spotted them, it's likely they spotted us," he said. "But they'll have to work to find us." The ship's radar echo might have blended in with the trees and water, she said, And the tide's coming in awfully fast. If we're lucky, they might not even see." "No such luck," he said, interrupting. Outside, thunder pealed, and the pair of sleek SL-15s banked low over jungle and beach, stooping to circle the wrecked dropship. "They found us." Grayson reached over Laurie's shoulder, stabbing at the frequency settings on the comm console. "Mccall, this is Carlisle," he said. "Mccall, aye," the Caledonian responded. "I'm tracking at the beasties, sir. Hold your fire until you've got your best shot, and concentrate on the aircraft, not on ground mechs. We're counting on you for anti-aircraft cover." "Aye, Captain, you got it." The RFL-3N rifleman, with its paired heavy lasers and autocannon mounted on each shoulder, had been designed as a fire support mech, but was well equipped for its secondary role as an anti-aircraft tracing and weapons platform. The odd propeller-shaped antenna of the mech's D2J tracking system mounted above and behind the cockpit provided rapid target acquisition that was particularly useful against airborne threats. Grayson spoke again. "All mechs, this is Carlisle. Hold your fire. Ready, on my command." The pair of enemy slayers thundered overhead again, but did not fire. "They're searching," he thought, "but they still don't know we're here." He felt a small thrill of pride that none of the mechs in his command had loosed a shot at the two fighters during their first pass. He watched the traceries of the fighter's path on the Hawk's battle screen. If they were scanning for active communications, they'd pick up the mech band the next time he gave an order. If the fighters had IR magnetometer gear, his men would be spotted almost at once. In any case, the mechs would not remain unnoticed among the jungle growth for long. "Now, Mccall, your best shot." The slayers banked sharply, arrowing toward the Wolverine. "Clay, duck and roll." Autocannon fire spat from the SL-15s, shredding treetop foliage in the whirlwind of leaf and branch fragments and splintering blasts. The jungle floor shuddered as the fighters whipped overhead at treetop level, spilling slender cylinders that glittered as they fell. The jungle erupted in flame and noise. David Mccall's riflemen stepped from the jungle as the slayers raced side by side across the mudflats and out over the sea. His mech's arms were already raised, the autocannon spitting fire as empty, smoking shell casings flipped into the sand. The flash and flicker of explosions, chewing along the starboard side of one of the fighters, made it lurch heavily to one side. "Now, Phobos, fire!" Lasers ignited streaks of tortured air. Chunks of smoking metal hurtled from the fighter already damaged. The other slayer banked left, twisting to avoid the unexpected fire. "Clay, report." "I'm fine, Captain," Clay's voice replied. "The bombs came in close, but not quite close enough. Thanks for the alert. Anytime. Give Mccall a hand." Martinez interrupted from her station aboard the Phobos. "Captain, the dropship is coming in into the east, range 2,000 meters. "Right, all units, did you hear? Company's coming. That would be mechs and ground support troops." "What was the rebel leader's name?" "Tullin. Are you listening in?" "Here, Carlisle. Have your people faced mechs before?" A pause. "Men? Against mechs? What the hell do..." "Listen, you'll have to trust me on this. I'm not asking you to face mechs. Those out there are going to have to support troops somewhere nearby." "Listen, Captain, you're crazy if you think my people are going to face up to a whole damn Curita army. Not an army, probably no more than a platoon or more of pop-up troops. I need infantry to keep them off our backs, and my people aren't organized yet." The Grey Death's personal weapons lay still wrapped in their protective slickers, cased in the transport lockers littering the beach beneath him, or behind him. It had been important not to show weapons to the approaching rebels, but it might have been better if his people had dug fewer trenches and opened more crates. Some of the 100-odd people in his command had guns by now, but not nearly enough. He considered quickly, then decided to give their new allies an option. "It's up to you. Take off if you'd rather, but we need your help." Tullin sounded grim. "We'll stay, but my people will deploy to my orders, not yours." "Fair enough. Ramage?" "Here, Captain. How many do you have armed?" 10 or 15, Captain." "Not enough." "Never mind. Have unarmed personnel rendezvous with the skimmers and stay out of trouble. Everyone with guns join the rebel troops and obey Tullin's orders. Got that?" "Sir, Colonel, do you mind taking a few new recruits?" Breznovich didn't speak for several seconds as he digested this unexpected trust on the part of the off-worlder. Very well, there was another pause, and then, and Captain, good hunting. The Wolverine had emerged from the trees 100 meters east of Mccall and was firing its autocannon, the stream of shells crossing the double stream from the rifleman. The Phobos added lancing beams of coherent light. The stricken aircraft staggered once again, billowing smoke. A flash and glitter of light marked the pilot's ejection, and then the Slayer began rolling wing over wing as it swooped and crashed into the jungle to the south. The explosion shivered the leaves in the trees. The other Slayer pulled up abruptly, gaining altitude. The rifleman tracked it, using laser fire now to save its onboard ammo. Dropship Leopard-class, Martinez reported from her observation point. Setting down 2 clicks east, he's unbuttoning. Lori, let's see what the other fellows are up to. Right, boss? She seemed steady, even excited as the battle took place. Deft motions of her hands at the mech's twin control sticks set the Shadowhawk in motion, while the mech's metal hands parted branches in the heavy gray drapery of something remarkably akin to Terran Spanish moss. From the jungle's edge, they could see 4 enemy mechs moving down the dropship's ramps and spreading out across the beach. At 2 kilometers, it was difficult to make them out. Lori queried her computer for a scanner ID. Diagrams traced themselves across her screen, green light on black, and words flashed across the drawings. Not good, Grayson said. A Marauder and an Orion. 2 heavies. A pair of Stingers. We can take the Stingers, no problem, but those 2? Grayson had faced a Marauder before. He had, in fact, faced 2 of them, one after the other in the last struggle at Thunder Rift on Trelban. A heavy mech weighing 75 tons. It moved with a menacing crab-like stride on rear-canted legs, and its oversized forearms mounted paired PPCs and medium lasers. The autocannon protruded from its exposed mount above the egg-shaped hull like a black spear. The Orion was an old design. Grayson had never seen one up close, though he'd studied them during his training. It massed as much as the Marauder at its side, though its squat, angular chassis was vaguely humanoid. The blunt muzzle of an autocannon protruded from an armored bay on its right side. Like the Marauder, it was handless, with medium lasers set into the massive van braces instead. The cockpit head was set low between the shoulders, the slit viewports giving the appearance of eyes. Khaled, here, Captain. I think we're in luck. They're deploying a lance of mechs, but no support troops. Gather the 2 wasps, stay in the jungle, but look for an opportunity to circle behind them as we draw them in. They have a pair of heavies, but altogether we outweigh them. We can take them if we save you for surprise. Yes, Coloresi, the ex-Saramat said, his voice taut with excitement. Allah Akbar. Right, okay, let's show ourselves, Lori. Grayson said, I want them down here, out from under the guns of that leopard. The Shadowhawk stepped fully from the jungle, and the enemy mechs hurried their pace. Missiles and beams lanced out from the dropship, but flew either too high or else splashed close by the Phobos, searching for the range. In ground combat, dropships depended on a high volume of fire rather than accuracy to protect themselves from advancing mechs, and these suffered the same fire control problems at long ranges that mechs did. The Leopard's fire should not prove too dangerous unless they ventured nearer. The Phobos returned the fire. Battle mechs on both sides began shooting too, though neither unit expected to do much more than keep the other side cautious at this range at over a kilometer. With most mech tracking units being centuries old and all cobbled together from other, even older units, they were not up to pinpoint accuracy across more than a few hundred meters. The Grey Death's mechs held their ground, while the Kurita mechs closed. By this time, the Draco scanners would have identified all 3 visible mechs and tallied the odds in favor of the attackers, 4 mechs to 3, 190 tons to 170. The Kurita machines proceeded even closer. At 500 meters, they were within effective range, and Mccall's rifleman began scoring hits on the Marauder with his autocannon. Each flash and bang of an impacting shell gouged heavy armor, sending bits and flakes of metal flying back over the Marauder's shell. Laurie joined in, firing the Hawk's autocannon in a long, ragged volley that stitched shells across the Marauder's port side and arm. Delmar Clay, meanwhile, turned his Wolverine's SRMs and autocannon on the Orion. The two Kurita light mechs hung back, shielded by the bulk of their comrades. Cannon fire thundered. The Dracos were probably surprised that they'd stood and fought, Grayson thought. Rebel forces, or mercenary units helping them, could not afford to stand up to the Kurita line unit and slug it out. The Combine had plenty of mechs on Verthandi, plus an unending pipeline of tools and repair parts from off-world. Each of the Grey Death's mech was priceless, and spare parts would be tough to come by. Delmar Clay's Wolverine staggered back a step as autocannon fire opened craters in the big mech's chest. "Keep moving, everybody," Grayson ordered over the battle circuit. "It's a long way to the nearest friendly repair facility." "Captain," Mccall said, "here. It's getting a wee bit warmish in here. I'm going for a wee dip. Right, we may join you." As the exchange of heavy cannon and laser fire continued, the Hawk's cockpit was rapidly becoming stiflingly hot. Grayson wiped at the perspiration beading his forehead and flicked it to the deck, then grabbed for a stanchion as Laurie tilted the machine sharply in response to a laser burst that scorched the Hawk's right side. He wished he could take off his uniform jacket, but there was no room. Anyway, the Orion was charging now, its lumbering gait heading straight toward the mercenary mechs. "Watch him," Grayson barked. "If he gets on the middle of us, we won't be able to fire at him without firing at each other." Mccall, his rifleman now waist-deep in the surging incoming tide, swiveled his mech's torso and hosed fire across the charging Orion. But it was Laurie who taught it to direct autocannon fire at the big mech's feet. Craters gouged the sand, filling immediately with dirty water. One of the Orion's broad feet came down into a shell hole with a splash, overbalancing the mech and toppling it forward into the foam. As Mccall's lasers scorched low across the sand from the sea, wet sand by the fallen Orion sizzled and exploded in gouts of steam. Laurie brought the Hawk's right arm to the point, its medium laser fanning white-hot destruction across the Orion's backpack electronics. Firing its jump jets with a rushing hiss, an enemy Stinger leaped, balanced, and then descended in steam and smoke. Cradling its right-hand laser like a pistol, it fired at the Shadowhawk's cockpit as it touched down. Grayson had already averted his eyes. Without the shielded visor of the Neuro helmet, the laser's monocolor pulse would have blinded him, even through the mirrored surface of the Hawk's shielded vision slits. He felt heat, intense heat, wash through the cockpit, and then the thunder of the Hawk's shoulder-mounted autocannon smacked into the lighter Stinger and sent it tumbling backward into the sand. Shellfire streamed across the Marauder, which had halted at the fall of the Orion. The Stinger at its side exchanged laser fire with the rifleman, which was now striding out of the sea, foam steaming from its legs. The Hawk's battle comm circuits garbled strange, shouted words, "Drokanach, Sasanach, oit inuslik." Mccall, the Caledonian, was totally absorbed in his firefight with the Kurita mechs. "Mccall, behind you!" "Drakustlik." The rifleman continued its inexorable advance, autocannon stuttering, shell casings spilling into the water. Low, skimming the water behind Mccall's mech, the aerospace fighter that had fled skyward earlier was returning, its nose lasers and autocannon twinkling in deadly synchronization. Founts of water gushed and sprayed on either side of the rifleman, and explosions blossomed along its back. The flat antennae of the D2J tracking system burst into fragments, and the mech's right arm went suddenly limp, the autocannon barrel swinging down to point into the water. The lasers aboard the Phobos swung heavily to track the new, unexpected target, but too slowly. Laurie brought the Shadowhawk's laser into line and triggered a rippling pulse of coherent light flat across the beach, scant meters above the rifleman's head and into the onrushing fighter. Shell fire and laser bursts were tracking past the toppling rifleman now, blasting sand, mud, and steam into the sky in an impenetrable curtain. Lori just kept firing at where she thought the target to be, tracking higher, then straight overhead as a shadow blackened the sky and thunder pealed. Then the Phobos fired, sending streaks of light burning through the sky. Red lights winked on Lori's console. "Damn," she said. "A shell took out her autocannon on that run." Grayson had not even felt the impact. He studied the battle screen. The fighter was continuing its flight due south. "I think you heard him, Lori, or Ilsa did. He's not going to stop until he hits Regis. Now, if we could just convince them." The rifleman was down, partly submerged in the swift rising tide, braced half erect on knees and gun barrels. If its fall had signaled the general advance for the Kurita mechs. Clay's Wolverine laid down a blistering salvo of laser, autocannon, and SRM fire. Missiles wove between the Kurita mechs, flashing with sudden, sharp impact, raining the enemy with mud, pocking their armor with shell bursts and charred, black slashes of laser strikes. Suddenly outnumbered 4-2, the Wolverine and Shadowhawk stepped closer together, almost side by side, spraying their attackers with concentrated fire. The Stinger was down again, not moving. Before Grayson could react to the sudden turn of events, 3 more mechs had stepped onto the beach from the jungle, 200 meters beyond the attackers. Grayson almost pointed out the new targets to Lori, then shouted in pure joy as he realized that the newcomers were the Grey Death's own light mechs. Hassan Khaled and his Stinger was snapping shots into the rear of the Marauder with vicious abandon. Both Wasps had joined Clay's Wolverine in a wicked crossfire that trapped the Orion and had the heavy machine reeling. The Kurita mechs wavered. If they broke and ran, they would run right through light mechs closing in behind them. "Khaled," Grayson cried into the comm circuit. "Scatter your force. Clay, you follow us." He urged Lori forward with a hand on her shoulder as though he were propelling the Hawk itself. Lori's sweat-soaked t-shirt was wringing wet under his fingers. The Shadowhawk fired its jump jets, causing Grayson to clutch again for the overhead stanchions. The machine crashed to earth on the far side of the fallen enemy Stinger, but then recovered its balance and continued its advance toward the foe. The remaining Stinger turned and fled, crashing headlong into Khaled's Stinger, which was charging from the other direction. Both mechs went down, arms and legs flailing. The Orion was limping heavily. The heavy, oily green sheen of coolant was smeared along its left leg like blood, and also gushed from a shattered knee joint. Smoke boiled from a scar in its left side. The Marauder held its ground, buying time, perhaps, for its fellows. Both the Hawk and the Wolverine concentrated their fire on the Marauder. For a full 30 seconds of blazing, fire-licked hell, the 3 mechs exchanged laser fire at close quarters. The Hawk's cockpit was an oven, an inferno that brought Grayson to the point of collapse. Heat overload alarms were shrilling as red lights rippled across Lori's board. 4 times he saw her slap the override switch when the onboard computer threatened shutdown. After that, he lost count. Lori guided the overheated machine through ankle-deep water, working toward deeper water where the sea would act as shield and coolant. The Marauder crabbed sideways. Though still firing, it was retreating now toward its dropship. Grayson spared a glance for the grounded dropship and stifled a yelp of surprise. There were 2 Kurita Leopards there now. The second must have grounded unheard and unseen during the battle. There was a stir of movement below the second ship, but he couldn't make out what it was. "Let me have magnification on the landing site," he said, and Lori punched a combination of buttons. The combat screen lit up with a magnified view of the base of the newly grounded dropship. Galleons. Grayson knew the Gal-100 from his ID lectures of years before. The tank was a fast, light, tracked vehicle designed to support mechs or infantry, or both. Instead of a full turret, A medium laser on a universal platform mount rotated on its broad, flat back, and a pair of light lasers were set in vertical shell turret mounts on either side just above the leader wheels. The galleon was fast, faster than any mech, though the sand of the beach might slow them here some. Its single disadvantage was its light armor, but the tanks were small and relatively cheap to produce. Most battlefield commanders could afford to lose 3 or 4 galleons to kill a single mech. This latest turn of the battle made Grayson curse bitterly under his breath. The enemy mechs were beaten, broken, but he could count at least 6 galleons moving down the beach. And there could be more behind, masked by their fellows. Those were the support forces he thought the enemy had neglected to throw in. Grayson was gripped by a momentary indecision. His mech force could not be pushed for much longer. One of his heavies was down, and both the Wolverine and the Shadowhawk had been squandering ammunition in attempts to overwhelm their targets with raw firepower. Worse, the Hawk could not withstand its current heat load much longer, and each discharge of the laser made things worse. He was sure that things were just as bad aboard Clay's machine. It was time to retreat now while they could. Yet it was wrenching to think of abandoning the field like this, with victory so close. The galleons were racing across the beach now, their treads kicking up spray behind them. Lori began firing with her laser, snapping shots off slowly and with great deliberation. Her heat alarms were shrilling again. Grayson had another thought. Would they be able to escape? The galleons were racing to cut them off on each side, from jungle and sea. With their high speed, they were devilishly hard to hit. A flash of light snapped across Khaled's Stinger as a laser struck home. Light flooded the Hawk's cockpit and Grayson covered his eyes. When he looked up again, purple blotches danced before his eyes, almost totally obscuring his vision. Briefly, he knew sharp panic, but the fear subsided as his vision cleared. The beam that had caught the Shadowhawk's head had not struck the vision screen squarely. It had been partly reflected laser light that had so dazzled Grayson's eyes. Lori stabbed off the last of the Hawk's head-mounted SRMs. "I don't think we can hold them, Gray." Explosions echoed across the beach, cracks and hollow-sounding booms under flame-shot clouds. A tank died horribly, flame boiling from its engine vents at its turret. The crewman struggled to free himself from an escape hatch, looking tiny and pitiful against the consuming blaze. The tanks slowed and stopped, their lasers tracking new targets. At first, Grayson had thought the explosions were the Hawk's missiles, but it was something else. Small containers, possibly glass, were being hurtled from the jungle's edge, breaking over the tanks' backs or on the surface of the water. When they broke, fire billowed skyward. Where the fire touched the water already lapping at the tank's treads, it spread, burning furiously. Skimmers burst from the jungle, just clearing the mud and shallow water. Men rode those skimmers. Some carried guns, but most were hurling containers at the galleons, then ducking low to pick up and light another. Grayson recognized the weapon. It was a glass bottle filled with a mixture of gasoline and oil. The neck stuffed shut with a strip of cloth soaked in the mixture. When the cloth was lit and the bottle hurtled, it became an effective grenade. Such weapons had been used by resistance forces against tanks on Terra long before man ventured to the stars. "Go, Lori, go! This is our chance." Brzezinski's rebels splashed among the trees near the water's edge, firing steadily to keep the crewmen buttoned up tight inside their vehicles. The skimmers circled, hungry. Another tank was alight. The others were retreating, except 2 that had strayed into muddy ground, already meter deep in the incoming tide. One struggled, its engine racing. The other sat motionless with its deck already awash. The Shadowhawk's last LRM sighed from its tube, the weapon status light for that tube flashing green to red. A galleon exploded. Fragments of armor rained into the water in a widening circle around the tank. Smoke mushroomed from it, casting rippling shadows across sand and jungle. Firing into the retreating enemy forces, Dabrowski's Wasp and Wolverine strode through smoky water that was knee-deep on the mechs. "All mechs," Grayson said, his voice unnaturally loud in the close, hot cabin of the Hawk. "All mechs, break off pursuit." Yalagurulis protested from his Wasp. "But Captain, we got 'em running." "They're running all right back under the cover of those dropships. Break off." Grayson fought down his own surge of battle lust. Their victory was complete, or as complete as they were likely to manage with a pair of heavily armed dropships backing up the enemy. Missiles ratcheted overhead from the enemy landing zone, exploding in sand and fury behind them. Grayson gave the order to withdraw.
And that, my friends, ends these chapters of The Mercenary Star